We're going to spend one class period on the character that is before us, whose name is Philo. Dramatic drum roll. I do want you to know this is really quite important, not because Philo is a significant character in the history of philosophy generally, but he's a very significant character in the history of the development of the New Testament. And that's why we take some interest in him. He is a Jewish philosopher. He is a Jewish philosopher, which makes him a hybrid. He's Jewish by birth, but Greek by thought. And he wants to unite, to synthesize Jewish thought on the one hand, basically with Plato on the other. He lived in Alexandria. So you'll often hear of Philo of Alexandria. That's the guy we're dealing with. He is a contemporary of Jesus and of the apostles. He lived at the same time. Probably never met any of them, nor they him. But the apostles were definitely aware of him. He's well, I won't say the first, that may be too sweeping, but he's one of the first to take an allegorical approach to the Old Testament. When you took hermeneutics from me, a couple of years ago, we talked about various allegorical approaches to the Bible. You may remember that, I hope you do. So if Stephen were going to study the Bible and look for an allegorical meaning, what exactly would we be doing? What kind of process would that involve?
Well, isn't allegory like story?
Yes, story, and then what's the feature of the story? What's the sort of unusual aspect of an allegorical story?
Isn't that it has a moral at the end? Or?
That's more of a fable, maybe. A fable has a moral at the end. An allegory is... Spencer, you're going to say?
I put my hand out when you said special feature because I.
Okay, Sydney, what's an allegory?
What is an allegory?
What is an allegory? Yeah, what is it?
It's an extended comparison of two like objects.
That's pretty good. That came straight from hermeneutics. Not bad. An allegory is a story in which the details of the story have symbolic meaning. So it's two stories. It's the story on the face of it, and then there's the story that's behind the scenes representing the interaction of the symbolic aspects of it. People, places, things, and so on can be symbolic. What's the most famous allegory in Christian history? It is one of the best sellers of all time in the history of the world, and it has been
Was that Pilgrim's Progress?
Pilgrim's Progress is an extended allegory. There have been many. All right, the point here is Philo, get this, reads the Old Testament allegorically. He's not so concerned about the story of, for example, the Tower of Babel. He's concerned about what does it symbolize? What's the symbolic meaning? He hears about Abraham being called from Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan. He doesn't care so much about that. He cares about the symbolic meaning. Abraham stands for the human race, or Abraham stands for the unbelievers in the world, or some such thing, but it's all allegorical. And then invariably, when he looks at the Bible and treats it allegorically, he finds in it Plato's philosophy. It's amazing. You read the Old Testament, who'd have thought that the whole Old Testament is teaching the philosophy of Plato? You know, you'd never guess that, would you? But that's Philo's discovery. And so he comes up with a kind of hybrid philosophy that mixes Jewish religion with Plato's philosophy. And it's called, in the history of these topics, Jewish Gnosticism. And it was around in the first century at the time the New Testament was being written. And parts of the New Testament respond to it critically, rejecting it. Philo, however, is very interesting. He places a huge emphasis in his approach to the Old Testament on the Logos. This word was all over the place in these days. So you should be able to tick off now some of the, Greek thinkers, Greek movements that have really highlighted the significance of the Logos. Who would they be? If I said, Matthew, tick off some characters, people, movements, etc. in Greek philosophy that have been particularly interested in Logos, you would, of course, without thinking very hard about it, be able to name what? 3 or 4 easily, for example.
Well, Aristotle.
Aristotle includes it in his rhetoric, Logos, Pathos, Ethos. So there's one correct answer. Who else? Plato doesn't do much with Logos. Okay, one hit, one foul ball. Yes?
The Stoics put emphasis.
The Stoics put an emphasis on Logos. Who else?
Well, I was just thinking that maybe the nominalists would, even though that was with Aristotle, but just that idea.
Not so much. So same thing. You split the difference there. One good answer, one not so good. Who else? Joe? Heraclitus. I tried to beat that drum way back there and say, please remember this. So, Joseph, thank you. You've made me happy. You've warmed my heart. Who else in the history of Greek thought places an emphasis on Logos? Somebody I mentioned to you about 1 minute ago. The answer would be, Jordan? Philo! And there's others. My point is that the idea of Logos is just bouncing all over the place in the Greek world in the first century. It was one of the most commonly referred to ideas that we could mention. Philo's no exception. All right. Tiny bit of bio for him. He's born about 10 BC. He dies about 50 AD. So he's about 60 years old at his death. Dies about 10 years BC. About the time Herod is completing the temple. He lives and dies in Alexandria. He was a major scholar in the Jewish community in Alexandria. The only thing we know for certain from the career of Philo is on one occasion he made a trip to Rome. He made a trip to Rome in about the year 40. Who was the emperor of Rome in the year 40? You all memorized this once upon a time. The emperor of Rome in the year 40 was Krista?
Vespasian?
Vespasian, you're a little it's earlier than Vespasian. He's more around 70 or so, yeah.
Who was Augustus?
It was not Augustus. You're a little too. He was early. Augustus was earlier than this guy. 40. He, outside of Nero, is the single biggest whack job who ever made it to the Roman throne, and his name is Megan.
Caligula?
Caligula. Little boots. At the time that Philo met Caligula, he was stark raving mad. That is, Caligula was, not Philo. But Philo comes home saying he was a very kind and gentle ruler, a little eccentric, but very reasonable. Now you think Philo is either an idiot or he's got a political agenda. The answer is the latter. He had some good reason to stay on the good side of the emperor, and so he gives them a pretty positive review, even though by that time Caligula was probably less than a stable human being. All right, that's about all we know about his life. All we know otherwise is his writings. He was influenced by a variety of philosophical strands. One influence was Jewish. He was indeed Jewish. So the influence is on Philo. Number one is Jewish tradition. He considered himself a good Jew. Secondly, he was influenced by the pre-Socratics, especially Pythagoras. He liked Pythagoras' theory of numbers. He was heavily influenced by Plato, especially Plato's Timaeus dialogue. The Timaeus dialogue of Plato details what? Laura? His creation account. Philo buys the idea that the God of the Old Testament is the demiurge of Plato. The demiurge was what, Nicole? What's the demiurge?
The fashioner.
The fashioner. So we would say Philo has a fairly inferior, inadequate view of the God of the Old Testament. He likes Aristotle's encyclopedic approach to things. He likes the categories, so he borrows heavily from Aristotle. He gets a whole lot of his stuff from Stoicism. My point is simply to say that if you read Philo, you will see virtually all the strands of Greek thought playing in at some point, including a little bit of his own Jewish, like a potpourri, a kind of stew, philosophical stew, in which he combines all of these different strands and puts them together in this highly elaborate, complex, improbable philosophy that is associated with Philo. Philo wanted, this is what he wanted. He wanted to make the Jewish religion palatable to the Greek world. He saw himself as an evangelist. He wanted the Greek world to recognize the wonders of the great Jewish heritage. But in the process of doing that, he kind of sold the farm, He gave up too much of his Jewish heritage to make it palatable to the Greeks. Do you follow what I'm saying? It'd be like Avery, you want to be an evangelist to the Islamic world, And you think to yourself, how can I do this? How can I reach Islamic people with the gospel? And so you basically take the Bible and you rewrite all the stories in the Bible to celebrate people like Muhammad and Allah and pilgrimage and, jihad. And pretty soon you say to yourself, this doesn't look much like Christianity anymore. It looks more like Islam. It seems like you sold the farm. You follow me? You see what I'm saying? That's what happened there. Yeah.
So was he trying to evangelize to the Greeks or be more accepted in the Greek
A little of
philosophy?
both. Very good question. Really a little of both. I think he started as an evangelist. He ended trying to be popular with the Greeks, So what happened? He was unsuccessful in reaching the Greeks. That didn't fly. He got virtually no mileage in the Greek world, but he had a huge impact on the Jewish world. Ironically, that wasn't what he was trying to do. But that's where he had his big kind of splash, was in influencing at least some level of Jewish thought in the first century. And that's why we hear in the first century of Jewish Gnosticism, that it was already out there. And it was affecting the Jewish world. And now here's the point. Some people who were coming into the Christian church were coming with all kinds of baggage from this Jewish Gnostic outlook. And there were two books in the New Testament in particular that virtually certainly were responding to Philo's Jewish Gnosticism and trying to straighten out confused Christians because they had been sucked in to a kind of Gnostic outlook largely coming from Philo. Two books in the New Testament. It's for sure. A couple more maybe. And you really don't get those books unless you understand this about why they were written. All right? Now, having said all that, kind of set you up for it, what are the books? What two books in the New Testament were almost certainly written in response to the influence of Philo? Sarah?
I think Colossians.
Colossians is absolutely correct. Good job. You read Colossians and it is nonsensical at many points unless you understand that it's responding to Philo. When Paul starts talking about and putting them in the same breath, worshiping angels, along with things like dietary restriction and so on, that's the hybrid of Jewish Gnosticism, because they were involved in kind of angel worship and they were observing the Jewish law, dietary restrictions, that kind of thing. What's the other one? That's one of them. Colossians is correct. And the other New Testament book, which virtually certainly was responding to Philo, was Jacob?
Galatians.
Sorry. Galatians is not, that's a good thought, but we don't find much of Philo in Galatians. You do find the Judaizers. You find that proto-Ebionite heresy in Galatians. Good thought. Megan?
Is it Hebrews?
It is Hebrews. Kayla, were you going to say that? No? Okay. All right. I saved you the embarrassment. All right. Those two. The book of Hebrews, many people, well, we haven't talked about authorship yet, but if you read the book of Hebrews, and if you're familiar with Philo's writings, Philo wrote in Greek, Hebrews was written in Greek, and you go through and you realize that a lot of the vocabulary used in the book of Hebrews is used nowhere else in the New Testament. It is unique to Hebrews, but it's vocabulary common to Philo. You follow what I'm saying? Greek words that are not found anywhere else in the New Testament are found in the book of Hebrews, but you also commonly find those same words and allusions in Philo. So that's been pretty important in understanding those two books. I want to come back a little bit to that later, but let me just give you a couple of additional thoughts here about Philo's philosophy. Major themes. Yesterday I gave you major themes in Stoicism. Major themes in Philo. There's only three. Shorter list. Going easy on you. One major theme in Philo, as I've already alluded to, so now make sure this is in your thinking and on your list, is logos. He makes a huge play of the idea of logos. What he means by logos, however, now is a little bit different than anything we've talked about. Philo has an idea, something like Aristotle's God. Remember Aristotle's God? This is a little inconsistent with the demiurge idea, and it's just a confusing point in Philo, so just kind of hang tight here. But he has an idea of a God, kind of at the center of things, and sort of like Aristotle's God, this God creates without trying very hard. This God just creates, just more or less by the nature of being there. And as he creates, the creation flows out of God in the form of what came to be called, I don't think Philo called it this, but it came to be called emanations. You took doctrine from me. We touched on this when we dealt with the topic of Christology. Anybody remember that? Emanations. Does that ring a bell at all? All right. Each of these levels is an emanation flowing out of God, sort of like light flows out of the sun. It is not the sun, but it is of the same nature as the sun. The light that comes from the sun is produced by the sun, utterly dependent on the sun. Emanations are produced by God, utterly dependent on God to be there. Okay, you kind of get the analogy. Emanations, in other words, God radiates, as it were, being the way the sun radiates light. This is kind of the way Aristotle conceived of God. Not quite, but it's the idea. God doesn't try to create, he just creates by being there. You know, just kind of his essence. When Philo conceived of this emanation concept, he said the highest, most exalted, pure aspect of God, the highest emanation of God, was called the Logos. He called, my friends, the Logos, this is Philo now, he called it the Huiou Theou. The Huiou Theou. The Greek scholars in the room, of course, immediately see the significance of that, right, Ben? The Huiou Theou. What does that mean? You recall? Go ahead.
The second word is God.
God, remember Huios?
I don't know.
Okay, anybody? Anybody else have Greek in here? Sydney, you had Greek from me, didn't you? She has a pained expression on her face, begging me not to call on her, because that was, after all, when you were in the, what, 7th grade? 7th grade, that she and Nicole both took Greek from me, and they both did very, very well. And I'm going to tell you now, both of you two, this was in the first vocabulary list. No, second vocabulary. Adelphos, anthropos, apostolos, dios, huios. It's in there. All right? And that word is, huios is the Greek word for? Anybody? No? Can't remember? All right, here it is. Sun. Sun. I shouldn't put this in the genitive. I know Sydney was embarrassed for me that I did that. It should be huiou theos. Nominative case, of course, the genitive is here. And it means, yes?
Is that son as in son like he's my son, or son as in he's...
No, this is son as in son of God.
Okay.
Okay. Please get this. Please get this. Philo, writing in the early 1st century A.D., independent of the New Testament, is referring to that which he calls the Logos, and he's also calling it the Son of God. Okay? Now, I just want to tell you this, because especially if you do any further theological studies, New Testament studies, you're going to definitely come across the theory that basically the New Testament is just reconstructing Philo's philosophy and giving it kind of a different spin, and that's what we all are as Christians, just people who've sort of inherited, Philo's particular outlook. I want to say to you that that is bunk, and that the very fact that the New Testament is so critical of Philo makes it clear that it's trying to correct a misunderstanding that was floating around in some Christian brains. So far from confusing us with them and saying, oh, we're just following Philo, we've got a Son of God, we've got a Logos, blah, 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 we're just like Philo. The whole point here is to distance us from Philo and say this is not what the New Testament is all about. Please understand that, especially if you see any theological studies in your future. Krista?
So would John 1:1 be
Mm-hmm.
in response to this, or?
Yeah. Well, John 1:1, I'm going to put it in a kind of a secondary status, but the Gospel of John itself, and especially the prologue, has been understood again as a possible response to Philo. But I think the argument there is a little more tenuous. These two, it's almost certain. What John was doing he may have known of Philo and been responding to that, but there's a much more complex argument there. So I'm a little bit I'm more tentative about saying that, but that's certainly been raised as a possibility. Yes.
Sorry, could you repeat what the misconception or what the problem was with the Son of
Yeah.
God?
Here's the thing to notice. Here's Philo writing, let's say, 30, 40 AD, contemporary of Christ, creating a philosophy which talks about a logos, which is also the Son of God. Oh, isn't that interesting? Because do we as Christians talk about a logos who is also the Son of God? See, facially, it looks like we borrowed from Philo. You see that? It looks like Philo was on the block first, using the term logos, the term of the Son of God. We Christians came along and thought, oh, that's cool. Let's do that ourselves. Let's call the logos the Son of God and write John's Gospel. And here we are 2,000 years later. We should be giving more credit to Philo. You follow? That's the accusation that's made. What I'm wanting to say is that on closer inspection, you find that not only are we not following Philo, we're actually criticizing Philo and trying to make sure we aren't confused with that kind of Greek emanation view. Does that make sense? I know I'm kind of running by this fast, but I don't want to spend that much time on it, but I want you to get this. The next thing Philo does after the logos is he talks about layers of angels. Angels, he says, are further emanations. Okay? Eventually you get down the chart till you get to man. Then you get to what? Rocks, and so on. It's a very Greek conception. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Can you repeat what emanations are? Are they just creations that flow out of
Emanation
God?
is God radiating or emanating being.
Okay.
This is all being. The analogy, Spencer, is the sun radiates light.
Okay.
God emanates being.
So then the problem with that is he would say that God created the Son of God, like the Logos.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That's one problem.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This led early Christian people, well, it led early Jewish people, some of whom apparently were Christians, to be involved in a kind of worship of angels. Angels were viewed as these emanations from God and worthy of worship. And that's why Colossians refers specifically to angel worship. It's referring to something that was done in the context of Philo's influence, you see. All right, the second theme is the idea of virtue. Philo is all about virtue, more or less in the Greek sense. He does an elaborate allegorical treatment of the book of Genesis, in which he basically works out these ideas. That you'll recognize the Greek flavor of this, but I want you to get Philo's spin on it. He says the body is defective. The body is inferior, imperfect. The soul is the heart of your humanity. It's the virtuous part of you. The soul is the higher part. The body is the inferior part. That's raw Platonism in Philo. He said that man began as a pure soul, but as a discipline, that pure soul was imprisoned in an imperfect body. And so we're in this present conflict between body and soul. Pleasurable sensations drag you away from virtue, pleasure of any kind. He's a bit of an ascetic. Avery, go ahead.
So would he say that before, like, I don't know how much of the Old Testament he believed, but before the fall,
Good
Adam
question.
and Eve were souls?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's for my very next point in my lecture. So that's always good when people ask the question that you're just about to address. You know, it shows that you're tracking with me. He takes an allegorical approach to Genesis. And to put it real simply, it's much more elaborate than this, but there's this idea. Man is created with original neutrality. Here's our soul. It is in a state of neutrality. He said he calls it the nude nous. The Greek word for nous means what? What is nous? It is, Sarah? Mind. It's nude. And what does nude mean? Let's make sure we all know this. Okay, the giggling in the room says we all know it. So, never know. Sometimes people haven't encountered that. It is the nude nous, your naked mind. There is depicted in the allegorical, story in Genesis. This nude nous doesn't know which way to go. Should I go in the direction of virtue or vice? Good or evil? The nude nous is there. Along comes temptation. Temptation, of course, is represented in that little story from Genesis as what? What is the symbol of temptation? Mr. Culverson, I know you're thinking about it. I can see the smirk on your face. Betraying your mind in the gutter. What is?
The serpent.
No, it is not the serpent. Oh, I'm so sorry. I misunderstood you. I wrongly accused you.
What was your question?
So the question is, what is the true symbol of temptation? He has some things he does with the serpent. Where does temptation come from in the garden? Second bite at the apple? No pun intended.
Apple.
No, not the apple.
The fruit of the...
No, it isn't. Where's the temptation? Oh, you guys have more pure minds than I thought. Where does the temptation go? Sarah, what do you think?
I'm guessing it has a sexual connotation.
Yeah. And so where does it come from? Where does it come from? Well, what symbolizes temptation in the garden? Hopefully with that, it's pretty obvious. Who is it? Who brings temptation to the picture? Yeah. The woman, certainly. Yeah, the woman. She comes to seduce the nude nous. I know, it's rough on you. Trevor's having a meltdown, I realize. All right. So, Philo takes a very, very sexually oriented approach to this story, as have many others. That's not unique to Philo. But he sort of views it in this Platonic term. Here's this mind, which is now going to be tempted by the temptress, who is Eve, trying to draw man away from virtue to a physically oriented kind of existence. All right? Yes?
So does he view a woman negatively, or?
Yeah. And that's pretty common of all of those who are touched by Greek thought. The female tends to be viewed with a certain degree of at least suspicion, if not worse. Okay? Women come along as that which trip up men, cause them to fall, cause them to go in a bad direction. And that's why you find a lot of asceticism, a lot of celibacy, a lot of kind of this life of purity that never involves itself with women, And that's just, so sorry about you gals, it's just the way it is. All right, so this temptation comes and Adam succumbs to it. he falls prey to this, and then the whole story of Genesis is redemptive. How can man escape then from this trap in which he has been captured by the seductive woman? And he has three different ways of redeeming yourself, symbolized by three different characters in Genesis. It can either come through instruction, education. That's one method of redemption. And for him, the model for that, the symbol of that is Noah. Don't ask me why. We don't really care. It just is Noah. Or it can come through discipline, through practice. And for him, the symbol of that is Abraham. Or it can come through native virtue, and the symbol for that is Isaac. All I want you to get from this, besides these little details, is it's basically pretty bizarre. Okay? It's pretty out there. All right. So virtue for him is your mind escaping the ravaging influences of the body. Third feature in Philo's view is a cyclical view of history. History repeats. This, of course, would come from Plato. It's a Greek view. Now, if you know this about, the more you know about Philo, the more sense it makes when you read, for example, Hebrews. Notice that the first chapter or two of Hebrews argues all about angels. It's one of the most extensive treatments of angels anywhere in the Bible. And you might wonder, why is this guy writing Hebrews? Why is he talking about angels off the bat? And Christ is superior to angels, infinitely superior. Which of the angels did he ever say this or that? He's trying to make this argument that the Logos, Christ, is utterly different from angels. He is not just the highest and greatest angel. He is something else. He should be worshipped. Those should not be worshipped. Why is this writer of the Hebrews going to so much trouble to make these points? Because he's writing to people who are over their heads in this kind of Philo outlook, you see. He talks about how Moses is superior. Well, Moses plays heavily in Philo's allegorical approach to the Old Testament. He's responding to certain views of Moses and Aaron. The whole deal with Melchizedek in chapter 7 of Hebrews. Well, Philo does all kinds of things with Melchizedek, symbolically, allegorically. And so this guy's writing against that. It's almost like he's taking Philo's writings and just going through piece by piece and trying to dismantle these perverse understandings of Christian faith that you get, from too much influence of Philo. In Hebrews, you hear again and again, Christ did things once for all. If you're familiar with Hebrews, you know that. Christ offered himself once for all. Why does he say that? Because Philo has a cyclical view of history. Nothing happens once for all. It's always coming back again and again, like a wheel turning. All right. In the last 5 minutes, let me ask you a question about who wrote Hebrews. You know that traditionally, who has been regarded as the author of the book of Hebrews? Who has traditionally been regarded as its author? Ben?
Isn't the debate that it was Paul or Apollos?
Okay, well, it's been traditionally regarded as Paul. Paul has been taken as the most likely candidate. There are huge problems with taking Paul as the author, because if Paul wrote Hebrews, he's writing in a style utterly different from anything else he ever wrote, using vocabulary very different from anything else that he ever wrote. There's all kinds of problems with that. Ben suggested the other chief candidate is Apollos, and kind of let the cat out of the bag there a little bit, but that'd be my view. And why would that be? Why do you suppose that Apollos has been regarded as one of the most likely candidates? for authorship of the book of Hebrews. What do you know about Apollos?
Well, does it have something to do with like the whole thing about the Jews or the Christians saying we were Apollos?
Yeah, it does. Apollos was in Corinth for a while. What do we know about Apollos? What do we know about him? Jacob?
I think that Apollos was educated, but he was more of an orator type
Okay.
of person.
He was educated. Where was he educated? Where did he go to school?
Wasn't it in Alexandria?
Alexandria. He is said to be a Jew from Alexandria. He is, yes. Right. Oh, it's time. Okay. Do not pay attention to this woman. Pay attention to this man. Okay? But you can go ahead and do this. Go ahead. He's educated. He is said to be eloquent in the scriptures. He's said to be trained basically in rhetoric, would be the point there. He seems to have been he was an associate of Paul's. And, you know, if you kind of triangulate all of the data that we have about Apollos in the New Testament, he winds up being about the only person that meets all the criteria. So it seems likely that this guy was trained in Alexandria, probably was at least familiar with and maybe trained by Philo. He may have been converted out of that, and he may have written Hebrews specifically to address himself to, I erased it, but Hebrew people. It's written to the Hebrews, Hebrew people who were especially being affected by the influence of Philo. Oh, those look yummy too. And so anyway, my money is on Apollos as the author of Hebrews for those reasons.